Hello.
Our story begins just outside the unknown regions, where Thrawn was situated. He was sent out alone to investigate the status of the civilized galaxy. The Chiss were well aware of the fact that they would have rivals coming for them soon. The unknown regions were hostile, and the Chiss Ascendancy knew they needed allies for the potential coming conflicts. Thrawn was one of the best members of their society, and so he was sent to investigate, understand, and perhaps even communicate with the known galaxy. A few years back, he entered the galaxy during a galactic conflict known as the Clone War. The hope was that that war was over and done with, so that the Chiss could start new alliances. As Thrawn entered the galaxy, he kept his eyes peeled for changes. The symbols were the same. The troopers and naval vessels were all very familiar. Thrawn kept at a safe distance, as to not be mistaken for an enemy transport, though this kind of order seemed like it was tyrannical. This wasn't unfamiliar to Thrawn. He could understand how that worked. His people were ruled by the aristocrat. Elitism and aristocratic formats weren't new to him. However, the state in the galaxy was far different from his previous understanding. His last encounter with the galaxy involved the Jedi, which seemed to be removed from the entire galaxy. That much Thrawn was unsure of. The Chiss Navigator continued to quietly move about, landing on planets around the mid and outer rim to scout out the movements of commoners under the rule of the Empire. His people were looking for strength, and while the Empire showed off its strength, young Thrawn couldn't help but identify how fragile it was. To Thrawn, strength should be silent. Never does one's strength come from walkers caving in cinder blocks on a street or an imperial fleet over townsfolk. The Empire, in his mind, had the ability to dominate the galaxy, but it felt fragile. The aristocrat had strength on the Chiss homeworld, but their strength didn't come from parading this galactic-sized military down the streets of a poor town. Thrawn couldn't help but admire the power, but he regretfully discussed its use. The Imperial military had the capability to be used for strength and prosperity, but instead, its uses were strength and oppression. They marched to assert control, they paraded to diminish hope, their spending went towards shiny new uniforms, paint removal, and new weapons for an ever-expansive military. There was, of course, the alluring aspect of the Empire. As a Chiss, it was his responsibility to find allies that could assist them in the rise of unknown region-related threats. But the prospect of aligning with the Empire so they could subjugate his own people wasn't a risk he was comfortable making, especially not without the guidance of the aristocrat. If they decided that the Empire was a feasible option, then he would go in and begin work inside their military. Thrawn spent a few more weeks in the Mid-Rim. He investigated different aspects of the Empire, and learned of the total collapse of the CIS movement. In the moment, something about the collapse didn't feel right. When he was last present in the established galaxy, the war was a grudge match, arguably within Separatist hands too. But they, in the span of a year and a half or so, with their superior numbers, warships, and military size, lost? Thrawn admired Anakinskywalker, but he was well aware of how logistically unsound the Jedi could be, so it was unlikely that they could do it. There was, of course, the Chancellor, who was now Emperor, but that again seemed too well executed to be feasible. Thrawn reported his findings to the aristocrat, informing them that there was something odd at the heart of the galaxy. The Empire was dominant, but somehow, two deeply established aspects of the Clone Wars were uprooted and vanished in the last half of the war. He didn't doubt that the Jedi could be dealt with, but the CIS, with all their military power, just vanishing? There wasn't even a hint of rebellion. In an effort to get a second confirmation about Thrawn's discoveries, Admiral Ziyara was dispatched from the Expansionary Defense Fleet to join Thrawn in the known galaxy. This wasn't in an effort to diminish Thrawn's reports, but they wanted a second opinion. Thrawn's concerns were justified, but perhaps he only saw a bad side to the Empire. The mission was to spend as long as they needed gathering intel on both the Empire and any potential threats to its power. Thrawn had reported that in the absence of the CIS, there were no rebel units, at least from what he could tell. To Thrawn, that seemed a little odd. The CIS, from his understanding, stood for a little less than 10 years, but they fought a 3-year war. Most governments so early into their foundation couldn't fight a war, so if they were capable of war, then they had to be capable of sustaining a rebel force in the post-war era. In addition, the Neutral Systems Coalition had seemingly disappeared. While he didn't value their militaristic or lack thereof might when comparing them to the CIS, he did have to acknowledge that they too seemingly vanished. With their mission from the aristocrat, Thrawn and Zyera moved back into the galaxy. It was a long and arduous journey for the two Chiss officers, as they scouted out locations across the mid-rim, outer rim, and even the core. They spent the longer part of a year watching, learning, and taking notes of everything they encountered. The two of them got along, but they butted heads a lot. In a way, it was good for them. They didn't dislike each other, but they certainly didn't like one another. So their ability to have a soft competition kept their minds churning. They were not just focused on learning, but making sure they came back with the best results possible. Through their time, they realized that despite the might of the Empire, similarly to what Thrawn diagnosed during his first trip to the galaxy after the fall of the Republic, was the fact that it was never effective. They were certainly watching the growing pains of the Empire, but from their perspective, its military was obsolete. The clones from the war, before, were vanishing, replaced with human soldiers and officers. There was order, sure. The Empire cracked down with its chain codes, but that again did not mean sufficient order. The Outer Rim wasn't even unified under the Empire. Former CIS worlds were forced to unite under the leadership of the Emperor, but they again showed no signs of fight. Perhaps Thrawn's original diagnosis was incorrect. Zyera was able to see what he was referring to in his first report, but it very quickly became clear to the both of them that if they sided with the Empire, they'd face military occupation. While the Empire hadn't moved far out into the galaxy yet, for example the Outer Rim or unknown regions, it was understood that once they did, they would subjugate the people to military rule. It wasn't starting an established government or adding to it. They completely took over, or put someone they liked into office, and forced the people to bend to the Emperor. That was not a fate Thrawn or Zyera wanted for their people, especially because the aristocrat would never bend to such power. So the silver lining was the fact that in their travels, they came across a couple individuals. They weren't many, but they were very adamant that they could fight the Empire. These people had more heart than the Imperials did. The best part about being Chiss is they had no loyalties. On one world they interacted solely with Imperials, on another solely with citizens. What they were able to gather in their final report was the resilience of the people. It wasn't something Thrawn was able to get in his first visit. Due to the extra eyes and ears, they were able to locate the fire burning in the outskirts of the galaxy. They were equipped with comlinks to communicate with these rebels. Though Thrawn and Zyera made a promise to each other. If the Ascendancy decided to join the Empire, they would destroy all evidence of ever having contact with these rebels, in an effort to make it a fair fight, not that they would need it. After weeks of deliberation, the aristocrat would decide that the Empire was not a feasible ally. They saw their rule and occupation of the galaxy as weak. Thrawn and Zyera both commented on how the Empire came across as arrogant, whereas the people, those rising up, were desperate. While desperation could be used as an instrument for self-destruction, it could, if properly manipulated, also be a sharp tool. The aristocrat believed that Thrawn and Zyera were talented enough to form alliances with these people. What the aristocrat believed they could do was form an alliance under their name, build it in the unknown regions, and then use said alliance to move against the Empire. This would aid the Ascendancy in two major ways. It would give the aristocrat presiding power over the rebels, allowing the Chiss to have political influence in the resurgence of the Republic or Confederacy or whatever other form of government followed the destruction of the Empire. It would secondly allow the Chiss to have strength and military size in the unknown regions. So if the Grisk hegemony rose up to fight the Chiss, they would have their support through the rebellion. The aristocrat believed they had a couple years to work with, so if Thrawn and Zyera could align themselves with shipbuilders in the mid-rim, outer rim, or even core, they could produce a shipyard for themselves at Scylla. The aristocrat feared what it would take to fund and supply these shipyards, but they had time to come up with an answer as Zyera, Thrawn, and a couple other notable and trustworthy expansionary defense fleet officers and navigators moved back out into the galaxy. The aristocrat dispatched 45 members of their military to do so. This was a huge risk on their part, solely due to the fact that they were leaving their defense fleet with inexperienced officers, but they were hopeful and trusting of their young and eager minds, as well as a very few very experienced members who opted to stay out of this mission. Due to the tight connection between Chiss members, they were able to actively communicate with others across the galaxy, or in between each other. What they were able to find once they started working in rebel circles was the fact that these rebels were actively fighting the Empire. However, they were not united. They had very little communication with each other, if any at all. Very easily into their work with the Alliance, they both developed and discovered a secret network called the Path. Something the Chiss were unaware of was the fact that the Empire was making it illegal to know about the Force. In an effort to remove the Jedi from their formerly heroic status in the galaxy, Palpatine framed them and then made it illegal to speak on the Force, to have the Force, or to remember the Jedi. The Path was created for Jedi and Force-sensitive men, women, and children who weren't able to be brought into the Order but faced purge. The network was created by a Jedi to save other Jedi from the rising Inquisitorius, Imperial troopers, or Palpatine's unknown henchmen. With less than 100 Jedi surviving the Purge, 2 of which going into hiding and 14 or 15 joining the Empire, the longevity of the Jedi Order was dwindling. The Chiss saw the Jedi as weak, especially Thrawn. They were very predictable. Their compassion made them weak strategists. To hunt the Jedi was easy because they exposed themselves. As it was understood, the Jedi Code was like an itch. The Jedi cannot help what they are, which in Thrawn's mind made them very risky allies. But at this point, they were necessary to the equation. The Path was the first established line of connection to other rebel cells, but this wasn't enough. The Chiss therefore directed people from the Path back to their homeworld of Scylla. The ability to hide these individuals in the unknown regions worked like a charm. Imperial targets vanished into the wind, and the Path slowly moved into the industrial sector. The Chiss were the primary focus on this, so while citizens, rebels, and former Jedi were moving Force-sensitive people through the Path to Scylla, the Chiss officers were creating connections and ties to individuals wronged by the Empire. These could be shipbuilders, designers, military personnel, or any number of things. The Empire had gone too far in the years following the Clone Wars. Sometimes all it took for these people was the word of a dedicated fellow rebel. Other times they needed to see the shipyard itself. Though the aristocrat realized they might eventually have a problem on their hands. The people of the galaxy weren't going to be supportive of one aristocratic form of government if they were running from another. However, the fear of the elite Chiss families was in bad taste. The people from the regular galaxy were extremely grateful for the kindness of the aristocrat. While they may have not fundamentally agreed with the system of government, they weren't going to judge them for having it. The Chiss may have had an aristocratic form of government, but they elected to save the people of the galaxy, rather than watch them suffer. That was more than what Palpatine was doing. Due to the unified network of the Chiss, they were able to create strong alliances between rebel cells across the galaxy, though it became obvious that more work needed to be done. Because the Chiss weren't commoners in the galaxy, they needed to infiltrate the Empire, so that the Imperial war machine didn't see them as Alliance sympathizers. Thrawn and Zaira were not individuals that joined the Imperial military. Instead, their primary focuses were on finding architects and shipbuilders. They knew that in order to stand up to the Empire, they needed something that the Empire didn't have. Through their various studies, they could see that the Empire was shifting from a starfighter-heavy navy to a bulkier ship-of-the-line navy. It was truly ironic to Thrawn. They had more power and influence than anything in the galaxy, and yet they elected to spend their credits on bulking up already large vessels. Though the Chiss knew, they could take advantage of this. While Venators were being decommissioned, former clones and rebel technicians were sent in to disable their transmitters, and then remove them from Venator graveyards across the galaxy. This allowed the Chiss and the Alliance to get their hands on fully functional, non-battle damaged ships of the line. While the Venator would never go toe-to-toe with the Imperial one-star destroyer, its carrier capabilities were all the Chiss were interested in. The rest of the schematics could be figured out once they had a strong fleet. The following 6 years would continue similarly to this. Thrawn and Zaira established strong connections with rebel cells across the mid-rim, outer rim, and core. With these connections, they were able to steal astromechs, technology, weaponry, and free oppressed people. Through a stroke of brilliance, the Chiss were able to locate former CIS vessels, take what was still functional, and then reprogram their battle droids to work as deckhands for the Chiss fleet. So while there were rebels fighting in skirmishes against the Empire, the Chiss Navy was doubling, tripling, and quadrupling in the unknown regions. The Empire was completely oblivious to it. There were also Mon Cala admirals and shipbuilders present on Scylla too. The way everything was formatted went as such. The cruisers, ships of the line, and carriers were controlled by former Techno-Union or Trade Federation battle droids. They were reprogrammed to be controllers or deckhands on these ships. The starfighters were controlled by sentient pilots or vulture droids. The issue is, the Chiss couldn't get their hands on many CIS capital ships or weapons, so the only thing they could really get their hands on were the battle droids or former Republic naval vessels. That was fine though, the establishment of the Rebel Navy was strong. Thrawn and Zyera were tasked with avoiding heavy conflicts with the Empire. Skirmishes were fine, but nothing broad. It would be through these skirmishes that Thrawn and Zyera would handpick the best pilots and captains in the galaxy. Due to the Alliance relying on fighter support, it was important to Chiss officers to figure out who could best lead fellow rebels. Among them was a young pilot and her Jedi friend, Hera Syndulla and Kanan Jarrus. Thrawn was initially concerned about the Jedi aspect of Kanan, but he very quickly understood that Kanan was balanced out by a maniac and a droid named Chopper. Hera was perhaps the best pilot in the entire resistance against the Empire. This was where Thrawn and Hera formed their own tight bond, both as brilliant strategists and also in their theory for how the Empire could be taken down. The Chiss also had another issue. They didn't stand for belligerence. Their alliance was weak, and it could be fractured by individuals who went far beyond the customs of warfare. So individuals that swore allegiance to Saw Gerrera's format were given a chance to rein it in or be destroyed. This came across as harsh, but the Chiss officers knew that the people of the galaxy would turn against their alliance if they were seen targeting civilians in the name of showing up the Empire. Their fight was one of revolution. They could not convince the people they were fighting for them if they were hurting them in the process. This really did aid the rebels, and with this declaration coming out of Scylla, those who used more unorthodox methods either listened or were destroyed. Killing off these loose cannons helped the Alliance garner more political support in the galaxy. While Mon Mothma and Bail Organa couldn't publicly recognize the existence of this group or even support it, the fact that they cleaned up their guerrilla fighters made them seem a lot more trustworthy. Despite all this transpiring on the frontier of the galaxy, there was yet another problem. The Empire was reported in the unknown regions. There were two very important locations to the Empire. Firstly, Ilum, and secondly, Exegol. Ilum had been used by the Empire for a while. It had just gone unnoticed until Rebel scouts located it. Instead of targeting or attacking it, they sent scouts to follow Imperial transports. Through this, Zyera was able to identify key targets of interest. The Empire kept transporting goods through the Red Honeycomb Zone, which to Chiss navigators was a no-fly location. There was something that the Empire had to be hiding in there. Also, the scouts spotted the early construction of a moon-sized space station. The Alliance came together and figured out how to make their strikes. In an effort to crush Imperial morale, the rebels moved at their respective targets. The first fleet conflict of the Alliance was used at Exegol, where a unit of Venators ran target exercises against a Sith temple on the planet, having used the tracker's waypoints to follow the course through the Red Honeycomb Zone and then get to the planet. While the Sith Temple, the Sith Eternal, and all their Project Necromancer research was being shredded, the Empire moved to defend the Death Star from a fighter assault. Admiral Thrawn, the highest-ranking Alliance leader, led the assault from a Nebulon B frigate. He simply stationed the ship outside the firing range of the superstructure with 3 Hammerhead corvettes, 1 Arquintans, and 2 Corellian corvettes. They were all there for any external support the fighters might need. Due to every single fighter craft used by the Alliance configured with a hyperdrive, there was no need to expose their Venator and carrier fleet this early. This small rebel fleet was much more believable, not that anyone would be making reports about this attack. The fight was over Scarif, and the Empire reacted by dispatching waves of fighters from the Shield Gate. However, Thrawn perfectly countered them. When it was revealed the superstation wasn't outfitted with a defense system, Thrawn moved to support ships to run cover fire for Commander Syndulla and her forces. Thrawn was well aware of her age, but he believed that age did not stop an individual's ability to reason. Only their personal limitations did. Hera Syndulla was a magnificent pilot, and she led her rebels on a vicious strike against the Death Star. The Alliance was able to rip the structure apart before evacuating the planet, similar to what the rebels over Exegol did. The Empire didn't have destroyers over Scarif yet, they just had a shield gate, but that's also because they didn't believe there'd be any reason to have destroyers ready outside of Scarif. After an hour-long skirmish, the rebels departed from the planet, having killed dozens of TIE pilots, hundreds of workers, and ripping apart the superstructure of the Death Star. The victory was remarkable. The rebels took very little casualties over Scarif, but there were some commanding issues that Hera needed to learn. More than anything, they were growing pains, something Thrawn himself was familiar with. Every great leader has their shortcomings early into their career. It's in the younger parts of their command where they learn to refine themselves into true leaders that win wars, not just skirmishes. Commander Syndulla would be one of those great leaders one day. Thrawn had no doubt in his mind about that. With victory, the Alliance used their political allies to make it public knowledge that the Empire was wasting credits on a moon-sized space station, using this revelation to call into question Palpatine's motives. There were several instances of the Senate losing their trust for the Emperor, and this was yet another attempt to show the Empire that he was losing his grip on his subordinates. The military had too much funding and too much freedom, but Mas Amedda didn't buckle. Within the next year, the skirmishes continued. At one point, General Kenobi from the Clone Wars found himself lost with the path, and at the end of his road, he was trailed by Darth Vader. Thrawn had been hunting for Vader. He was well aware that it was Vader who killed numerous Jedi. With knowledge of Vader's hunt, thanks to Roken and Tala informing their allies in the unknown regions, Thrawn quickly gathered together a unit to engage. The hyperdrive was busted on the vessel the rebels were escaping with. Many of these people were like the thousands to millions of others Thrawn had seen move through the path. The Chiss opened up the path to be more galactic in scale, and more effective at recruiting the fighters for the Alliance. As Vader stood on his bridge, his deckhand called over to him, informing him that they had 7 objects approaching from hyperspace. Grand Inquisitor looked over as Vader turned back. Out from hyperspace dropped 3 Venators, 2 Acclimators, and 2 Hammerhead Corvettes. Thrawn loved the Hammerheads. They were classic, but also sturdier than most Corvette variants of the modern era. Regardless, upon their exit, he blitzed the Star Destroyer. The Path vessel containing Kenobi, Leia, and Roken landed inside the hangar of Thrawn's Venator, as Hera led the first few waves of rebel fighters from various hangar bays. Thrawn moved the Acclimators back once they deposited their fighters. The Star Destroyer couldn't do anything. Their heavy cannons fired on the Venators, but the frontal shields were raised all the way up, with light firepower coming out. All the Star Destroyer could do was pick the wrong targets. As Vader started moving off the bridge to get to his fighter, it was struck by a torpedo, and the shock flung Vader off the rafters and onto some of his deckhands. Luckily, the shields were still up. Thrawn could see the Imperial vessel prepare to make its move for hyperspace, so he told Syndulla to target the engines. Give it everything they had. She pulled the Ghost over the shields and fired everything down into the engine panels. Behind her came wings of Y-wings. As TIE fighters tried to intercept, Z-95 headhunters cut them off, shredding them, while the Hammerhead Corvettes moved out under the cover of fire from the Venators. Vader crushed a couple of the deckhands as he climbed out and demanded that they get out of the system. As the orders left his mouth, the engines were shut down. Inside of Thrawn's bridge, the doors opened up behind him as he turned around to see a Jedi Master wearing gray robes. Behind him, there was a child, with her hand in his. How peculiar. Obi-Wan told Thrawn that they needed to destroy that ship. Vader was inside. The Admiral of the fleet smiled and turned his head back to the front of the ship, as his battle droids plugged away into their consoles, ripping the hull of the Star Destroyer apart. It was so unprepared. The Destroyer's shields weren't up when Thrawn arrived out of hyperspace, so they were heavily damaged before they could even get prepared. Now, it was a losing battle. Commander Syndulla continued destroying fighters as Thrawn called them back in a fighting retreat, as Lord Vader and Grand Inquisitor were destroyed in an explosion that started in the reactor. While Obi-Wan wanted to return to protecting Luke, he decided, after redeeming Reva, to fight with the Alliance. They could win, and he was once a general. Why not shake the dust from his commanding mind and help them win this fight? The subsequent losses of Exegol, Vader, and the Death Star were troubling the Palpatine, but in an unwise decision, he punished the people. It was a mirror to how his contingency orders would have gone. Palpatine was so focused on making sure the people paid for their failure to fight the resistance that he lost one key factor: hope. The rebellion gave people hope. They won, and they showed off their wins. Truthfully, the Alliance felt bigger than it actually was. This was very intentional from the Chiss, Thrawn, and Zaera. In an effort to rally support, they made sure they only engaged in skirmishes they could win, not to mention they never engaged in full-blown battles or contests. So all Imperial citizens saw was their overly expansive military getting popped by a quote-unquote lesser foe, and because the Alliance didn't have a presence in the known galaxy, there was no real way to pinpoint its size or where it was. While yes, the rebellion was considerably larger with the assistance of the Chiss Ascendancy, it was still small in comparison to the Empire, but no one knew that. The rebellion existed almost entirely in the unknown regions. The Empire had no clue where these rebels kept hiding at. The aristocrat a couple years back moved the fleets of the Alliance to the other side of a maelstrom in the middle of the unknown regions. It gave them protection from Imperial patrols, which never even got to Scylla as it was, but the main point being that the galaxy believed the Alliance was equal in size and power to the Empire, so they were fully under the impression that this war could sway heavily into the hands of the Alliance. With the Empire cracking down on its citizens, Palpatine tried to figure out where these rebels were. Due to the Empire being tracked from Ilum, Palpatine couldn't exactly expose anything to the wider Imperial network. Not that he knew that they were being tracked from Ilum as it was, but it was the fact that Ilum, Exegol, and the Death Star were all top secret. Palpatine couldn't expose those secrets, especially with the swaying of political interest in the Senate. The Chiss decided to allow the Empire to freely use Ilum for the time being, since they never caught on to being tracked from there, so why let them find and use another secret location, when they could continue to use this one to expose more chinks in their armor. Shortly after Vader's death, the Alliance began fighting in actual battles with the Empire. The message was interpreted as a direct response to Emperor Palpatine's crackdowns and martial law. This gave the people extra incentive to rise up and fight back. General Kenobi would be crucial in fighting on the surface of planets, while Admirals Thrawn, Zyera, Akbar, and Raddus pushed the fight in space. The Alliance was very focused on the space combat side of everything, which is why their deals with the Mon Cala led to a bulking up of their naval power. The first few actual battles of the war with the Empire were deliberate strikes. The Alliance knew everything about the targets they were hitting before moving into them. This again being part of their movement to rally together the people of the galaxy. It worked. On Coruscant, protests started, until they were silenced. Luckily, Senator Ryo Chuchi exposed what the Empire did on Coruscant, before she lost her life in a clear assassination. What followed was a deconstruction of Imperial support in the core. Many Imperial citizens saw that Palpatine was silencing them, but as this rally began, the Alliance had its first true loss of the war. Admiral Akbar mistakenly moved his fleet into uncharted territory, and they were hit by an Imperial trap. They were blindsided by an interdictor field that they barely broke out of, but the battle still resulted in a terrible look for the Alliance. However, Admiral Zyera and Raddus joined their fleets up to make sure this loss was avenged, as they smacked an Imperial shipyard, killing a renowned Imperial Moff and an Admiral in the process. From there, the conflict went into overdrive. What remained of the Jedi rallied what people they could, while space combat took precedent over the war. Thrawn was able to use clone contacts to get a readout on the location of Palpatine. There simply was just no way for them to get to the Emperor himself. Thrawn badly wanted to wipe him off the map, but it was impossible. Instead, a grueling war commenced, one the Alliance feared it wasn't ready for, but they were. Without distractions from various borderline homicidal members, they could focus on winning the actual war, not keeping everyone in check. It was a slow grind, but after the first year, the people of the galaxy were able to unify in the core and push Imperial power away from stability. This allowed the leaders of the rebellion to get close to the Empire, but when they approached Coruscant, the Emperor was gone. It turned out he kept unreliable sources available for those spying on him. This allowed Palpatine to avoid interactions with his enemies as they took control over the galaxy and he vanished from the front of it. He didn't attempt to build a second Death Star, he simply believed he would beat the Alliance in a head-on engagement. These thoughts were wrong, but for a Sith, his overconfidence was his weakness. Palpatine was so convinced that the rebels would lose steam once they hit the mid-rim that the core would rise up. His theory was semi-correct, but they then gained a resurgence due to protests and riots on the core, something Palpatine did not predict. In the end, the Senate was able to keep its structure and reform into a government as Palpatine vanished from his role as Emperor. The Sith Lord, now without his Inquisitors or Vader, was forced to ensure the survival of his religion. Without Exegol, he decided to avoid contact with other Sith worlds. He knew that the Admirals of the Alliance were clever, so he was going to keep them on edge. As the New Republic started to take a stand, the Chiss Ascendancy demanded representation within the government, which they were gifted. They used this to propose and suggest the New Republic militarize. Due to being from the unknown regions and fending off a couple hostile nations during the war, they were well aware of how vile the galaxy could be. Their threats and concerns were taken with legitimacy. The New Republic had a lot more desire to move forward than the Empire did following Order 66, because while both wars were grueling, the rise of the New Republic felt like something desired by the entire galaxy, rather than just the elite. But just because the Empire was sworn out didn't mean they vanished. It was a standing government for the longer part of a decade. The rebels needed to maintain peace without making the same crucial mistakes made by the Empire in the first couple years of their reign. Thrawn knew he couldn't really play a role here, so he took his main fleet and returned to Scylla. His belief was that his fleet would be most useful out here, due to the Empire shrinking away from the core. It was likely that they would show themselves in the Outer Rim or the unknown regions. This hypothesis was proven correct in the following months. The Chiss Ascendancy kept a close eye on everything in the unknown regions. It's why they had so much power in the Senate. Despite being a part of the New Republic, their exterior never showed signs of it. Their shipyards had Chiss Ascendancy logos, not New Republic or Alliance ones. While having a spot in the New Republic Senate, the aristocrat never made themselves public faces. This was done for a number of reasons and agreed to by the New Republic, but the main one being is they didn't want the Imperial Remnant to believe they were part of the Republic if they were in the unknown regions. This wasn't for anything sinister, simply so they could expose the Empire if they showed themselves. Another reason was also because of other threats in the unknown regions. Acting like they weren't a part of the New Republic would grant them the element of surprise against any potential attackers, which is how they discovered the Empire once again. Palpatine moved back to Ilum, still not seeing it as a cause for his downfall. Due to the Death Star never being completed, he decided he would focus all Imperial resources on building Starkiller Base. In his mind, it would be the perfect way to return to the galaxy. He wouldn't just destroy a planet, he would destroy the entire galactic core from a distance. From there, he could subsequently target any other heavily populated system in the galaxy until the galaxy surrendered to him. Palpatine was going to play this for as long as he could. No need to expose himself without protection. His plan entailed building up a new military with stronger battleships and a new army from brainwashed children. He wanted a completely subservient empire, one that wouldn't fall victim to the same foolish mistakes as his previous one. What he didn't expect was for the New Republic fleet to drop out of hyperspace on top of him. Admirals Thrawn, Zyera, Akbar, and Raddus, along with General Syndulla, came to finish off the Empire. In an almost arrogant way, the entire battle was broadcasted from Admiral Thrawn's newly customized winged MC-80 variant. The Liberty-class cruiser was double in size, as per Thrawn's request, and outfitted with double the hangars, double the cannons, and of course, heavier shields. The Empire was unprepared, and ironically, the massive vessel that Thrawn had wasn't really necessary. There was a brief fight with the remainder of the Imperial fleet, but the fight mostly took place on the surface of Ilum, where rebel bombers ran trench runs on Imperial facilities, one of the torpedoes blowing Palpatine into a memory. The victory over Ilum would result in the total collapse of Imperial Remnant activity. The last-ditch effort of the Empire would come from a super star dreadnought attempting the kamikaze into a Corellian shipyard, but that never got anywhere, thanks to the work of the New Republic fleet. While there would be motions to demilitarize, the whole of the New Republic would not. The military wouldn't be as vast as the Empire, and many of the Alliance-era vessels maintained their position inside the New Republic fleet. There wouldn't be much of a need for a larger military. Every couple decades, the ships would be retired and replaced with new variants, built out of the old parts, just so the older vessels weren't wasted in ship graveyards. The Jedi in the meantime would have a chance at rebirth, with 50 members, ready to join Master Kenobi. Luke and Leia would eventually join their place in that Jedi Order as well. The Chiss Ascendancy, on the other hand, remained very vocal inside the Republic, but they never enforced their aristocratic power. They were grateful they assisted the galaxy, and they were glad they chose a fighting force that, not impressive initially on paper, had the determination to secure the galaxy for the foreseeable future. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to our patrons: Benjamin Wells, Ozpin, Angel Dust, Alexandra Reese, The Beginning and End, Django Fett Clone, Nick5098, INTJ Recluse, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pure Mark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tibbs, CC2024, Galactic Gaming, Tristan Mandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Grandy Bane, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Cullen Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewa670, Annika Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Knox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tam, Johnny DeGuin, Sansa Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Cali, Galaxy 66, Mammoth Studios, Anakin003, Lord Draken, Photos Legacy Star Wars, Airbus, Rex the Wolf, The Man with 3 First Names, Dark Saint 46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash that like button. Support me other ways, go check out Patreon. There's cool things on there, like early access to videos or Sith Clone Wars early updates. Otherwise, let's talk about this story. So I really wanted this story to focus on the brilliance and the tactical side of it. This story overall is a very wide, broad-scale story, and I kind of wanted it to stay that way. I didn't want to get too intimate with any characters. I really wanted it to focus on how the Chiss Ascendancy itself could help the Alliance, and since we've done so many different variants of this, I wanted the Chiss Ascendancy to really build the Alliance in the unknown regions, but it's because of their presence in the unknown regions, they're able to locate Exegol, the Death Star, and eventually Starkiller Base before it becomes Starkiller Base. And so I wanted the Chiss Ascendancy to really be the key to everything, but also kind of having a silent place in this story. So I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.